The gas has been lowered to a faint blue murmur, and around a heavy mahogany table in a rented parlour in Marylebone, 8 people are joining hands in the dark. Her palm rests between 2 strangers, the man to her left a retired naval officer. She has met only twice. The woman to her right, a widow from Maida Vale, who weeps quietly before every sitting begins. She wears black from throat to wrist, the mourning silk gone slightly dull at the elbows from repeated wear. Her hair pinned back in the plain, practical knot that has replaced the elaborate coils she wore before her son died. The tablecloth under their linked hands is a deep burgundy chenille, worn thin at the corners from years of gripping fingers. Above them, a gaselier hangs unlit and useless, its brass fittings catching the last thread of blue light before the medium calls gently for the final lamp to be put out. Then the room goes dark entirely. For a moment there is only breathing, 8 sets of lungs finding a shared, unsteady rhythm, and the faint tick of a mantel clock behind the window curtains. And then a rap. Not loud. A neat, dry knock like a knuckle against wood, though every hand at the table is accounted for, and none of them has moved. A bell rings seemingly out of the empty air above the sideboard, and in the space across the table where the medium has been sitting in silence for 11 minutes, something pale begins to emerge from the darkness at her mouth. It catches what little light remains, a thin, luminous ribbon at first, then a wider mass drifting down across the front of her dress like a curtain being drawn from somewhere inside her own body. It gathers itself in the air and takes on, unmistakably, if only for a few seconds, the shape of a hand. Small. A child's hand, its fingers curling once, as if in greeting. She has been coming to this room nearly every Thursday for 4 years, and she has trained herself past screaming. What she does instead is lean forward in the dark, her whole body straining toward that pale shape, because for 4 years the one thing she has wanted more than any other thing in this world is to be certain that her son still exists somewhere, that he did not simply stop, that this small curling hand belongs to him, across whatever distance separates the living from the dead, to tell her that he is safe. This is London in the final decade of Queen Victoria's reign, and in rented parlours and drawing rooms across the city, on any given evening, hundreds of people are sitting exactly where she is sitting, holding hands with strangers in the dark, waiting for the dead to answer. What she does not know, what none of the 8 people at this table know, is that the room around them is quietly holding chemicals dangerous enough to blister skin and catch fire in open air. That the sideboard by the window and the folds of the medium's dress conceal machinery of real sophistication. That the small, pale hand drifting in front of her has, at other sittings, been swallowed. And that the woman producing all of it has spent the better part of the last hour learning everything she now claims to already know, simply by listening. Beneath all of that, the murmured hymn someone started humming before the lamp went out. The crepe, the practiced composure of 8 adults holding hands in the dark. The story is far more complicated, far more uncomfortable, and far more human. This is 1890, and Britain sits in the final years of an age that has learned to live beside death without ever learning to speak of it out loud. Since the middle of the century, in nurseries and hospital wards and crowded churchyards from London to Liverpool, a generation of parents has buried children at a rate that would be unthinkable 100 years later, and an entire machinery of black crepe, jewelry woven from a dead child's hair, and strict rules about how long a widow must wear her veil has grown up around a grief the culture had nowhere else to put. The church offered scripture. The doctor offered very little at all. Spiritualism offered something neither of them could, It offered proof, not comfort through faith, but an actual conversation, evidence you could hold in your hand or hear with your own ears, that the person you loved had not simply ended. This video is about what that promise actually looked like from inside the room. Not the version that has survived into cartoons and Halloween costumes. The medium in a headscarf hunched over a crystal ball. The real mechanics. The chemistry, the carpentry, the psychology, and the very real human cost of it on both sides of the table. We are going to spend time with the toe joints of two teenage sisters in upstate New York who accidentally built an entire industry out of a parlor trick. We will look closely at the trick knots and the telescoping rods hidden inside a medium's sleeve, at a substance called ectoplasm, and what it was actually made from, at a glowing paint that could set a woman's own dress on fire while she wore it, and at the moment documented more than once. When a skeptic in the room finally reached out in the dark and turned the gas back up, and everyone present saw exactly what had been happening around that table. We will also spend time with the women themselves, the mediums, many of them poor, many of them barely out of girlhood, who found in this strange trade something the rest of their century refused to give them anywhere else. Before we go further, if this kind of honest history is something you value, if you would rather sit with the real version of the past than the comfortable one, take a moment to subscribe. It costs you nothing and it helps keep this channel going. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me which era of history unsettles you the most. I read every one of them. Let us begin, as so many of these evenings began, with an ordinary woman deciding, once again, that she would rather spend her Thursday night in a dark room with strangers than spend one more night at home not knowing. Her name is Margaret Coombs, and in the autumn of 1890, she is 34 years old, the wife of a solicitor's managing clerk named Arthur, and the mistress of a narrow brick terrace house on a quiet street in Peckham, south of the river. It is not a grand house. It has a front parlour kept for visitors, a small garden with a coal shed at the end of it, and a single servant girl who comes in 3 days a week to help with the heaviest work. Margaret is, by the measure of her own street, entirely respectable. She attends church on Sunday mornings. She pays calls on the appropriate afternoons. She has raised her remaining 2 children, a girl of 11 and a boy of 8, on the same principles of quiet obedience and clean collars that were used to raise her. When 6 years ago, in September of 1884, her third child, a boy named Frederick, whom everyone called Freddie, died of diphtheria 11 days after his 5th birthday. It took him the way it took thousands of children across Britain that decade, a membrane closing slowly across his throat until he could no longer breathe, his small body fighting for 4 days in an upstairs bedroom while a doctor who could do very little came and went. Margaret held him for the last of it. She has never, in 6 years, told another living person exactly what that felt like, the particular weight of him, the particular sound. What Margaret looks like beneath the composed exterior she presents to her street is a woman who has not slept a full night since 1884. She is thin in a way her dressmaker discreetly adjusts for. There are days she cannot remember whether she has eaten. She keeps a small oval locket at her throat under her collar where no one can see it, containing a curl of Freddie's fine brown hair, and she touches it, without meaning to, dozens of times a day. Her husband, Arthur, grieves too, in his own contained way. But he has his work, his club, the ordinary forward motion of a man's public life to carry him through the days. Margaret has the house, the 2 remaining children, and the hours after they are asleep, which is when the missing arrives in full and finds her with nothing to do about it. Which is why, a little over 4 years ago, on the recommendation of a neighbor whose own dead husband had reportedly sent word through a medium in Bayswater, Margaret Coombs went, for the first time, to a sitting. She went, half expecting to be embarrassed, to sit through some theatrical nonsense and come home feeling foolish for having tried. What she got instead, in that first sitting, was a series of small raps in answer to questions only she and Freddie could have known the answers to, and a feeling she can still summon perfectly, 6 years and perhaps 200 sittings later, of the ground opening slightly beneath her chest. Not certainty, not quite, but the first thing resembling hope she had felt since the funeral. Her 2 remaining children have grown up alongside this ritual without ever fully understanding it. Her daughter, now 11, knows only that mother goes out on Thursday evenings to see a friend and has learned not to ask further questions after being met once with a silence heavy enough to teach her the subject was closed. Her son, 8, barely remembers Freddie at all, and Margaret has caught herself, more than once, feeling a small private grief about that, forgetting too. A second loss layered quietly on top of the first, the slow erasure of her middle child from the memory of the family he was born into. She keeps the household running in every other respect, exactly as a woman of her position is expected to. Menus are planned a week ahead and given to the servant girl on Monday mornings. Arthur's shirts are pressed and his boots are polished before he leaves for his chambers each day. Visitors who call on the correct afternoon find a woman who pours tea steadily, asks after their own families with real attention, and gives no outward sign whatsoever of the hours she has spent the night before lying awake doing arithmetic she has never told a living soul about, how old Freddie would be now, what year he would have left school, whether he would have taken after his father's quiet steadiness or her own restless nerves. He has been going nearly every week since. Arthur does not entirely approve, though he has stopped forbidding it, since the alternative, watching his wife disappear further into silent grief at home, seemed worse to him than the vague social embarrassment of a spiritualist wife. Her sister thinks it is unhealthy. Her vicar has said, carefully, that he worries for her soul. Margaret has heard all of it, and she keeps going anyway to a rented parlour above a stationer's shop in Marylebone to sit in the dark with strangers and a woman named Mrs. Selina Vane, who is, depending entirely on which room you happen to be standing in when you ask the question, either a gifted spiritual instrument or a very skilled and very poor woman doing whatever it takes to keep a roof over her own head. A private sitting of this kind typically costs somewhere between 2 and 5 shillings, with a full private consultation from a well-established medium, sometimes running to a guinea or more. A sum that Arthur's own weekly clerk's wage, of perhaps £2 to £3, made him quietly aware of every single time his wife put on her coat and gloves on a Thursday evening. He had never once refused her the money. He had also never once asked her, directly, what precisely it purchased. A small domestic silence between them that had become, over 4 years, its own kind of arrangement, each of them managing Freddie's absence in a currency the other did not fully examine. This is the body and the world we are going to spend the next several hours inside. Not a costume drama. A specific woman in a specific house, carrying a specific, unrelenting weight, walking once a week into a room built entirely around the machinery of her hope. If you picture the strict mourning rules, the Victorian era at all, you probably picture them as a kind of fashion. Black crepe dresses, black bordered stationery, a widow expected to wear her veil for a year and a day. It reads, from this distance, like an elaborate and slightly morbid etiquette system, the sort of thing that belonged to costume dramas and stiff formal photographs. Something performed. A rule book for grief invented by a society that liked its rules. The actual reality, sitting underneath that etiquette, is a set of numbers most people have never been asked to hold in their heads at once. Across the middle decades of the 19th century, in the crowded industrial cities of Britain, something close to 1 in 5 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, and the general filth of urban water supplies before proper sanitation reform took hold in the 1,870 and 1,880 moved through nurseries with a regularity that made a healthy household the exception. The social historian Judith Flanders, who has written extensively on the domestic life of the period, has described a Victorian household in which the presence of death was so constant that families kept ready-made mourning clothes in the house the way a modern household keeps a first aid kit. Not because they expected the worst, because the worst arrived, on average, more often than it did not. Across the Atlantic, a different catastrophe was adding its own weight to the same scale. The American Civil War, fought between 1861 and 1865, killed something in the region of 620,000 soldiers, a number that, adjusted for the size of the population at the time, would be equivalent to several million American deaths today. The historian Drew Gilpin Faust, in her study of Civil War death, has documented how thoroughly that war reorganized the way Americans thought about dying. Bodies were often unidentifiable, or unreturned, or buried in mass graves far from home, which meant that hundreds of thousands of families were denied even the basic ritual of a body to bury and a grave to visit. Grief, with no object to attach itself to, went looking for one elsewhere. It found spiritualism waiting. The movement had already begun in 1848, before the war, in a farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, but the war gave it a scale it had not had before. Mary Todd Lincoln, whose 11-year-old son, Willie, died of typhoid fever in the White House in February of 1862, turned to at least one medium, a man named Charles J. Colchester, who reportedly conducted sittings inside the White House itself while her husband, the president, was still alive and still fighting a war that was producing exactly the kind of grief his own household was suffering. She was not an outlier. She was, in this respect, entirely typical of her moment. A nation burying its young men by the hundreds of thousands, and a first lady sitting in the dark trying to hear one more word from a child taken by disease rather than by the war at all, were the same phenomenon wearing 2 different faces. Britain had, at the very top of its own social order, a working model of exactly this grief on permanent public display. When Prince Albert died of what was recorded as typhoid fever in December of 1861, Queen Victoria did not simply observe the conventional period of mourning and return, in due course, to public life. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her reign, kept Albert's rooms at Windsor, prepared each morning as though he might still use them, and set, by the sheer visibility of her example, the tone for an entire nation's relationship with bereavement. The commercial machinery that grew up to serve that tone was substantial and specific. Jay's Mourning Warehouse, established on Regent Street in London in 1841, and expanded considerably in the decades that followed, sold ready-made mourning dresses, black-bordered stationery, and the crepe veiling that every respectable widow was expected to produce on short notice. Since death rarely gave a household the luxury of advance notice or a dressmaker's usual fitting schedule, jewelry made from a dead relative's own hair, woven into brooches, rings, and watch chains by specialist hairworkers, was neither eccentric nor rare. It was across the middle and upper reaches of Victorian society, an entirely ordinary way of keeping a small physical piece of someone who was gone, worn openly and without embarrassment at church, at dinner, and at exactly the kind of sitting Margaret would one day attend herself. A specific black gemstone called jet, mined chiefly around the seaside town of Whitby on England's northeast coast, became so closely associated with mourning wear after Victoria's own widowhood that Whitby's jet workshops expanded dramatically through the 1860s and 1870s, a small coastal industry built almost entirely on the back of a nation's collective, decades-long grief for one woman's husband. For Margaret Coombs, none of this arrives as history. It arrives as a specific Tuesday afternoon in September of 1884, a doctor's bag on the bedroom floor, and a silence in the house afterward that nothing since has quite managed to fill. She did not think of herself as part of a demographic pattern when Freddie died. She thought of herself as the only mother in the world whose child had just stopped breathing. It is only later, sitting for the first time among 7 strangers in Mrs. Bra's Vane's rented parlour, that she understood, slowly and without much comfort in the understanding, that every single person at that table was carrying some version of the exact same Tuesday afternoon. The naval officer had lost a wife to puerperal fever after childbirth. The widow from Maida Vale had lost, over the course of 11 years, 3 of her 5 children. Grief in that room was not a private failure. It was the ordinary condition of being alive in that decade, and spiritualism was one of the very few places in Victorian society willing to say so out loud. The naval officer's loss belonged to a pattern nearly as common as childhood death itself. Puerperal fever, an infection contracted during or shortly after childbirth, killed mothers across Britain in numbers that remained stubbornly high for most of the century, in part because the connection between a doctor's unwashed hands and the infections that followed him from patient to patient was not widely accepted by the medical establishment until relatively late, despite earlier work on the subject by physicians including Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna in the 1842, whose findings were largely dismissed or ignored by his own profession during his lifetime. A young woman in 1882, Britain faced a genuine and statistically meaningful risk of dying in the act of bringing a child into the world, which meant that grief in a room like Mrs. Vane's parlour rarely travelled in only one direction. Husbands mourned wives lost to childbirth. Wives mourned children lost to disease. Grief moved through Victorian households in both directions at once, touching the cradle and the marriage bed with almost equal indifference. The class dimension of all this mattered enormously, and it mattered in ways that rarely survive into popular memory of the period. Working-class families in London's poorer boroughs buried children at considerably higher rates than the families of clerks and professionals, like Arthur Coombs, packed, as they were, frequently drawn from sources contaminated by the very waste they were meant to carry away. But grief did not respect the class lines that govern nearly everything else in Victorian life. A duchess who lost a child to scarlet fever mourned inside better furnished rooms than a costermonger's wife who lost a child to the same disease, but she mourned. Spiritualism, notably, drew sitters from across this entire range, from aristocratic drawing rooms where the scientist and spiritualist convert William Crookes conducted his own investigations, down to the modest rented parlours, gathered around tables that had been borrowed rather than owned. Some of that contaminated water supply produced catastrophes vivid enough to be remembered on their own terms. The physician John Snow traced a severe cholera outbreak in London's Soho district in 1854 to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street, removing its handle and effectively ending the local epidemic in a demonstration still taught today. Before Snow's work was widely accepted, cholera arrived with the terrifying, indiscriminate suddenness of a plague, killing a healthy adult within a day of the first symptoms, and it returned to Britain in serious waves in 1832, 1849, 1854. Into the very thing killing its children. A household that had survived one wave of cholera had no particular assurance it would survive the next, and it is against this backdrop of recurring, unpredictable mass death, not a single distant war or a single bad year alone, that the appetite for some kind of certainty about the fate of the dead has to be understood. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in the fact that an entire industry of contact with the dead could only have grown as large as it did in a culture that was, at the exact same time, dying at a rate none of its members would have accepted as normal if you had described it to them plainly. The strict mourning etiquette was never really about fashion. It was a culture's attempt to build a container sturdy enough to hold a grief that arrived far too often to be handled any other way. And when the container proved too small, which it did, again and again in nursery after nursery, people went looking for something the container could not offer. Not rules for how long to wear black. An answer. If you picture the people who believed in spiritualism at all, you probably picture the uneducated, the credulous, the superstitious poor looking for a miracle because they lacked the education to know better. It is a comfortable assumption, because it lets the modern listener stand safely outside the whole phenomena. Those people, back then, believed strange things. We would not have been fooled. The actual reality is considerably less comfortable, because spiritualism was never a movement of the uneducated. Its early sitters and eventual converts included the physicist and Fellow of the Royal Society William Crookes, the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who had independently arrived at the theory of evolution alongside Charles Darwin, and later, though slightly outside our own decade, the author Arthur Conan Doyle, whose devotion to the movement would eventually outlast his friendship with Harry Houdini entirely. By the estimate of Emma Hardinge Brisson, a spiritualist writer, and one of the movement's own chroniclers, adherents in the United States alone numbered somewhere in the millions by the late 1862, a figure modern historians treat with real skepticism, but which, nonetheless, reflects a movement operating at a genuinely mass scale, rather than a fringe one. By the time the movement crossed the Atlantic and took hold in Britain in the early 1850s, it had become, in cities from London to Manchester, a fixture of respectable middle-class evening entertainment as much as a spiritual practice, with sittings advertised in newspapers alongside concerts and lectures. What made spiritualism different from the conventional religions sitting beside it in every Victorian parlour was its central promise, which was not comfort, but evidence. A vicar could tell a grieving mother that her son was with God. Spiritualism offered to let her hear it from the boy himself, or something close enough to convince her. Central to this promise was a concept first articulated in detail by an American named Andrew Jackson Davis, a largely self-educated visionary from Poughkeepsie, New York, who described, in a series of trance-dictated books published beginning in the late 1840s, it was not the vague cloud and harp heaven of Sunday sermons. Davis described Summerland as a place remarkably like Earth, with houses and gardens and schools, where the dead continued to grow, to learn, and critically, for a mother like Margaret Coombs, where children who had died in infancy or early childhood did not remain forever frozen at the age of their death, but continued growing up, cared for. Surrounded by others who loved them, the infrastructure built around this promise was neither small nor short-lived. The Banner of Light, a spiritualist newspaper founded in Boston in 1857, ran for decades, carrying testimonials, lecture schedules, and columns of messages purportedly received from the dead, distributed to subscribers on both sides of the Atlantic. Spiritualist camp meetings, Week-long gatherings that combined lectures, group sittings, and a kind of religious holiday atmosphere drew thousands of attendees to purpose-built grounds such as Lily Dale in upstate New York, founded in 1879 and still operating as a spiritualist community today. A longevity that says something plain about how deeply the movement's promise took root rather than simply passing through as a momentary craze. In Britain, similar gatherings and dedicated spiritualist halls sprang up across London and the industrial north, giving the movement a physical weekly communal presence that felt, to its members, considerably closer to a church than to a passing entertainment. No single figure did more to establish spiritualism's respectability among the British upper classes than the Scottish-born medium Daniel Douglas Home, who arrived in England in 1855 and spent the following 2 decades performing for aristocrats, minor royalty, and the literary establishment, all while, remarkably, never once being caught in an outright fraud despite extensive and repeated testing. Home's most famous claimed feat: a levitation out of one window and back in through another. At a house on Ashley Place in London in 1868, was attested to by 3 witnesses present in the room and has never been satisfactorily explained by skeptics in the century and a half since, which made him both the movement's strongest single piece of evidence and a considerable irritant to its critics. Not every prominent figure of the age was convinced. The poet Robert Browning, who attended a sitting with Home in 1855, at which a spirit hand reportedly crowned his stepson with a wreath of flowers while pointedly ignoring Browning himself, left thoroughly impressed and published a long, scathing poem, Mr. Sludge, the Medium, in 1864, portraying a fictional medium caught mid-fraud and pleading, in exhausting detail, for the sympathy of the very sitter he had been deceiving. Photography offered its own version of the same promise and its own version of the same fraud. The American photographer William Mumler began producing what he called spirit photographs in Boston in the early 1860 seconds. Portraits of living sitters with a faint, translucent second figure hovering behind them, identified more often than not as a deceased parent, spouse, or child. His most famous image, taken in the early 1870 seconds, showed Mary Todd Lincoln seated with a ghostly figure standing behind her that sitters and newspapers alike immediately read as her assassinated husband. Mumler was tried for fraud in New York in 1869 after investigators demonstrated that his double exposure technique could be reproduced by any competent photographer with access to his studio's existing negatives, and after several of his spirits were identified as still living Boston residents whose earlier portraits he had simply reused. He was acquitted on a technicality and continued working for several more years. His surviving photographs, a strange, faintly moving record of exactly how badly an entire generation of the bereaved wanted a camera, of all things, to prove that a face they loved had not disappeared entirely. The established church, for its part, treated the entire movement as a genuine spiritual danger rather than a harmless eccentricity. Clergymen across denominations preached against spiritualism from the pulpit, frequently reaching back to the Old Testament story of the Witch of Endor, in which King Saul consults a medium to summon the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel and is condemned for the act. A scriptural proof that seeking contact with the dead through any human intermediary was expressly forbidden, rather than merely unwise. This theological objection ran alongside, and occasionally in direct tension with, a more mundane clerical worry that spiritualism was quietly emptying pews of exactly the grieving parishioners a vicar most needed to comfort, by offering them something a Sunday sermon never could, an answer instead of an assurance. This detail did more work than almost any other single feature of spiritualist belief in drawing bereaved mothers specifically toward the seance table. The fear that haunted women like Margaret was not only that her son was gone, but that he was somehow suspended, alone, unfinished, a 5-year-old boy wandering forever through some featureless void with no one to look after him. Summerland answered that fear directly. It told her Freddie was growing up somewhere, that he had teachers, that other mothers who had died were caring for him in her absence. It is difficult to overstate how much psychological relief a specific, populated, almost domestic vision of the afterlife could offer to a woman whose actual religion had given her, at her son's funeral, very little beyond the general assurance that he was with God. For Margaret, the promise arrived in fragments over her first several sittings with Mrs. Vane, delivered less as formal doctrine and more as answered questions. Is he cold? He is warm and cared for. Is he frightened? He is not frightened. He plays with other children. Does he remember me? He remembers you every day, and he grows a little each year, as he would have grown here. Whether any of it was true in the sense Margaret needed it to be true was in the moment almost beside the point. What mattered was that for the first time since September of 1884, someone was answering the exact questions that kept her awake at 3 in the morning. Instead of offering the vague, well-meaning consolation her vicar had been offering for 6 years. The broader context worth understanding here is how quickly and how thoroughly spiritualism organized itself into something resembling infrastructure rather than a passing fad. Within a decade of the Fox sisters' first rappings in 1848, which we will look at closely in a moment, there were spiritualist newspapers, spiritualist lecture circuits, spiritualist congregations with regular Sunday meetings, and a small but genuine professional class of mediums who supported themselves entirely through sittings, lectures, and the sale of trance-dictated writing. Some historians have noted that spiritualism, in this sense, functioned as a kind of religious entrepreneurship, uniquely suited to its moment, requiring no seminary training, no ordination, no institutional gatekeeping of any kind. Anyone who could produce a convincing rap, a compelling trance, or a plausible written message from beyond could, in principle, open a practice. This democratic quality was part of what made the movement grow so quickly, and it is also, as we are about to see, part of what made it so easy to exploit. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that a movement so often remembered today as gullible superstition was, in its own time, taken seriously by some of the era's sharpest scientific minds, that its true center of gravity was never really the seance parlor trick at all. It was Summerland. It was the specific, tender, almost unbearably domestic image of a dead child, growing up safe somewhere, still being cared for, still becoming himself. That image, more than any bell or any rap in the dark, is what kept women like Margaret Coombs climbing the stairs above the stationer's shop in Marylebone, week after week, year. If you picture the ritual trappings of a Victorian seance at all, the darkness, the joined hands, the hymn, someone always seems to hum before the lamp goes out, you probably picture them as atmosphere. A way of setting the mood, of easing nervous sitters into the right frame of mind for something otherworldly to occur. Stage dressing for a spiritual event, no different in kind from incense in a church or candles at an altar. The actual reality is that almost none of it was decorative. Every element of the traditional seance room examined closely turns out to be doing a specific piece of practical physical work, and the work is concealment. Darkness was typically justified to sitters on the grounds that spirit forces were delicate and easily disrupted by light, a claim with no basis beyond its own usefulness, since darkness is also, not coincidentally, the one condition under which a hidden thread cannot be seen, a sleeve cannot be examined, and a hand can be quietly withdrawn from a chain without anyone noticing the gap. Where full darkness was not tolerated by a particular sitter, Mediums frequently substituted a single low gas jet, turned down to a dim blue or red glow, light enough that sitters felt reassured they could see something, dark enough that almost nothing meaningful could actually be observed. The psychical researcher Frank Podmore, who spent much of the 1,890 seconds cataloguing and critiquing spiritualist phenomena for a skeptical but engaged readership, noted repeatedly in his writing how often mediums insisted on lighting conditions that happened to be exactly the conditions under which their particular effects were physically achievable, and no others. The joined hands, similarly, were rarely the simple unbroken chain they appeared to be. A skilled medium could free one hand from a sitter's grip, while that sitter continued, in good faith, to believe both hands were accounted for, either by pressing the sitter's fingers together so they gripped each other rather than the medium, or by relying on a confederate seated nearby to quietly extend a hand or a foot in the medium's place at the crucial moment. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882 specifically to bring some rigor to these investigations, developed increasingly elaborate test conditions in response, at various points requiring mediums to have their hands and their feet both held simultaneously, or sewing sitters' sleeves to the medium's own clothing, or seating the medium inside a specially built cabinet with an observer stationed at each side. The Italian medium Eusebia Palladino, tested repeatedly by investigators associated with the Society across the 1,890 seconds, produced results that shifted dramatically depending on how tightly these conditions were enforced. Under loose observation, she was caught, more than once, quietly working a hand or foot free to produce a wrap or a table tilt herself. Under considerably tighter observation, investigators reported phenomena they struggled to explain by any means they could identify, a discrepancy that scientists of the period argued about for years without fully resolving it, and one that later stage magicians would eventually attribute to conjuring skill, sophisticated enough to survive even careful scrutiny. Some investigating committees went further still, painting luminous bands onto a medium's hands and feet before a sitting, so that any movement in the dark would leave a visible trail of light for the observers stationed around the room to follow. Others ran a fine thread across the medium's lap, low enough to be invisible but sensitive enough to signal, by its tension, whether a hand had actually left its place at the table. Mediums who understood these countermeasures learned in turn to work around them, freeing a foot rather than a hand where a thread guarded only the table's edge, or timing a movement to the exact moment an observer's own attention had drifted toward a creaking floorboard or a sitter's cough. The contest between investigator and medium was, by the final decades of the century, a genuine arms race, each side refining its methods in direct response to the others, in a way that had very little left in it of casual credulity on either side of the table. The furniture of the room did its own quiet work as well. A sideboard positioned within the medium's reach might hold a bell, a tambourine, or lengths of gauze prepared in advance. A cabinet, curtained off in one corner, ostensibly provided a place for spirit forms to gather and condense before entering the room proper, and also, not incidentally, provided a private space in which a medium's assistant could work unobserved. Even the singing of a hymn before the lights went down, which sitters understood as a devotional preparation for what was to come, served the additional and entirely workmanlike function of covering the sound of chairs shifting, drawers opening. Marylebone itself, the district where Margaret sat every Thursday evening, was no accidental choice of setting. The area had been home since 1872 to one of London's earliest organized spiritualist societies, a group of inquirers who met regularly to hear lectures, arrange sittings, and lend the whole practice an air of civic respectability that a lone medium working alone could never quite achieve on her own. Independent mediums like Mrs. Oaf, Vane, renting rooms rather than belonging to any formal society, benefited from proximity to this respectable institutional presence, without being bound by its rules, borrowing a little of its credibility by simple association with the neighborhood, while running her own sittings on her own terms. In a rented room, a short walk from a society that would have found her methods, had it examined them too closely, considerably harder to defend. For Margaret Coombs, none of this machinery was visible or even conceivable in the years she had been attending Mrs. Vane's sittings. What she experienced was a set of rules that felt, if anything, reassuringly rigorous. Vane always insisted on the darkness herself, with an air of slight apology, explaining that the spirits found strong light distressing, in the same tone a hostess might use to explain a minor eccentricity of her household. Sitters were asked to hold hands in an unbroken circle as a matter of ordinary courtesy and safety, so that no one could be accused afterward of having crept about the room in the dark. Margaret had always found this reassuring rather than suspicious. A woman running a fraudulent operation, she assumed, would hardly invite this much structure, this much apparent scrutiny, into her own sittings. She had no way of knowing that the structure itself, the darkness, the chain of hands, the hymn, the curtained cabinet in the corner, was the fraud's actual architecture, built with as much care and craft as any honest tradesman put into his own trade. The physical experience of an ordinary Thursday evening had, for Margaret, become its own kind of ritual comfort, quite apart from anything supernatural. She knew the exact 7 stairs up from the stationer's shop below, worn smooth in the middle from decades of feet, and the particular smell of the room at the top. Coal smoke settled into the curtains, the faint sweetness of the lamp oil, a trace of the lavender water Mrs. Neff Vane wore behind her ears. She knew which chair she preferred, the one with the slightly loose left arm, positioned so her back was to the window rather than the door, though she could not have said why that mattered to her until she noticed, one evening, that it let her feel the small comfort of a solid wall behind her while she gave her attention entirely to the dark ahead. She knew the particular quality of silence that settled over the room in the last minute before the final lamp went out. 8 people breathing carefully, the mantel clock ticking louder than it had any right to, and she had come, over 4 years, to find something almost soothing in that silence itself, independent of whatever did or did not follow it. The broader picture, once you understand the mechanics of the room itself, is that spiritualism operated across a genuine spectrum of intention, and the room told you almost nothing about where on that spectrum a given medium sat. Some mediums, sincerely convinced of their own gifts, still relied on darkness and the honor system of joined hands simply because that was the tradition they had inherited, without any particular awareness of what the tradition made possible. Others understood the mechanics with total precision and built their entire livelihood around them, refining the exact placement of a cabinet or the exact dimness of a gas jet, the way a craftsman refines a tool. Sitters like Margaret had almost no way to distinguish between the two from inside the experience itself, since both kinds of medium ask for precisely the same conditions, for precisely the same stated reasons. There is a particular kind of quiet unease worth sitting with here, in the discovery that the very features of the séance that felt most solemn and most careful to the people inside it, the reverent dark, the unbroken circle of hands, were also its most functional tools of deception. The ritual and the trick were not sitting side by side in that room. They were, in most cases, the exact same object, viewed from 2 different directions. If you picture the origin of spiritualism at all, you probably picture something grander than what actually happened. A charismatic prophet, perhaps, or a deliberate and carefully planned deception cooked up by adults looking to profit from a superstitious public. something with intention behind it from the very beginning, built the way a con is usually built top-down by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The actual reality began instead with two sisters, Margaretta Fox, who was 14, and Catherine Fox, who was 11, in a small rented farmhouse in Hydesville, New York, in the spring of 1848. Their family had already been troubled for weeks by strange knocking sounds in the house, the ordinary kind of noise an old wooden farmhouse makes that a nervous household under stress had begun to read as something uncanny. On the night of March 31st, the girls, whether out of mischief, boredom, or impulse, neither of them fully explained even decades later, began answering the knocks. They asked the source of the sound to rap once for yes and twice for no, and they got answers. The spirit, when questioned further, identified itself as a peddler who claimed to have been murdered in the house some years before and buried in the cellar. The girls called it, with a kind of dark childhood humor that history rarely preserves, Mr. Splitfoot. What Margaretta and Catherine were actually doing, and what Margaretta herself would demonstrate in explicit physical detail 4 decades later, was cracking the joints of their toes and knees against the floorboards and bed frame to produce a sharp, dry knocking sound that carried remarkably well in a quiet room and was almost impossible to trace to its source, since a listener's attention naturally goes to the walls and furniture rather than to a child's foot tucked under a nightgown. It is, mechanically, an almost absurdly simple trick. It requires no equipment, no accomplice, and no preparation beyond a double-jointed toe. And it is precisely this simplicity that made it so difficult to detect and so easy, once it had been demonstrated, for the rest of the movement to build upon. The sisters did not remain a private family curiosity for long. Their older sister, Leah Foxfish, already an adult, living apart from the family, recognized the commercial potential in what her younger sisters could do almost immediately, and began arranging public demonstrations in Rochester, New York, within the year. By the early 1852, the Fox sisters were touring, sitting for paying audiences in hired halls, and effectively establishing the commercial template that the entire spiritualist industry would follow for the rest of the century: ticketed public sittings, private paid consultations, and eventually, for the most successful mediums, something close to a full theatrical circuit. The rapping itself, once demonstrated as a viable phenomenon, was quickly adopted and adapted by other mediums using other methods entirely, including small mechanical devices concealed beneath table legs, the cracking of an apple seed or a knuckle against wood, and rigged furniture with hidden weights and levers that could produce a knock at a discrete pressure from a knee or a foot. The sound itself became, within a few short years, a kind of universal opening note for the entire practice, a signal to any seated group that contact had been established, regardless of which particular method any given medium actually used to produce it. The showman, P.T. Barnum, always alert to a paying attraction, reportedly attempted to book the Fox sisters for exhibition in New York in these same early years, and approached the sisters, and their managing older sister ultimately declined, preferring the somewhat more dignified circuit of private and semi-public sittings to Barnum's Museum of Oddities. The distinction mattered enormously to how the movement wished to present itself. Spiritualism wanted, from its earliest professional years, to be received as a serious inquiry into the nature of death rather than a carnival attraction, and the sisters' own choices, whatever their private motives, helped steer the young industry toward parlors and lecture halls rather than sideshow tents. Domestic character the movement would carry for the rest of the century. Skepticism, in fact, arrived far earlier than most people assume, and it arrived from exactly the kind of institution that ought to have settled the matter on the spot. In 1851, 3 professors of medicine from the University of Buffalo examined the Fox sisters directly and published a report concluding that the raps originated in the voluntary displacement of the knee joint, a mechanism entirely consistent with what Margaret Fox would demonstrate publicly. Their report changed almost nothing about the movement's growth. It was read by relatively few people outside medical and skeptical circles, while the Fox sisters continued touring, continued filling halls, and continued, for decades afterward, to be treated by a very large public as the founders of a genuine new form of communication with the dead. A scientific explanation, publicly available since 1851, simply could not compete with the emotional pull of what the rapping seemed to offer. 40 years later, in 1888, Margaret Fox, by then a middle-aged woman whose life had been marked by alcoholism, poverty, and a long public feud with her sister Leah, appeared on stage at the New York Academy of Music and confessed, in considerable physical detail and before an audience of newspaper reporters, that the entire phenomenon had been a trick performed with her toe joints from the very beginning. She removed her shoe and stocking on stage and demonstrated the cracking sound directly, and physicians present examined her foot and confirmed the mechanism was physically real and sufficient to produce the sound the world had spent 40 years attributing. She recanted this confession roughly a year later, under circumstances that remain murky and are still debated by historians of the movement, and died in poverty in 1893. Whatever her private, shifting feelings about her own legacy, the New York Academy of Music demonstration remains one of the most thoroughly witnessed and physically corroborated events in the entire history of spiritualist fraud. Kate Fox, the younger of the 2 original sisters, fared little better in the years surrounding the confession. Her own struggles with drinking had become public knowledge by the 1880 seconds, severe enough that in 1888 the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children briefly removed her 2 young sons from her care on the grounds of parental neglect. Playing out in the very same year as her sister's stage confession, and largely overshadowed by it in the press of the day. Both sisters died within a few years of each other in the early 1890 seconds, in circumstances considerably more reduced than the packed halls, and paying nobility of their younger years, a decline the movement they had founded rarely dwelt on in its own retelling of its own origins. The rapping itself crossed the Atlantic within just a few years. An American medium, known publicly as Mrs. N. Hayden, is generally credited with bringing table rapping sittings to London in 1852, holding sittings for curious and often skeptical members of the English public who had, until that point, mostly encountered the Hydesville story secondhand through newspaper reports. Her visit is widely treated by historians of the movement as the effective starting point of British spiritualism as an organized practice, rather than a foreign curiosity read about from a distance, which means that every element of the tradition we have been examining, the rap, the darkened room, arrived in Britain within roughly 4 years of 2 sisters in a New York farmhouse, first cracking their toe joints against a bed frame to frighten their own mother. None of this reached Margaret Coombs as a story she thought much about. By 1890, the rap was simply a fixture of the practice, an opening note as familiar and unremarkable to sisters as an organ prelude before a hymn. She had heard raps at nearly every sitting she had ever attended, and she had never once, in 4 years, wondered seriously about their mechanical origin, any more than a churchgoer wonders about the specific carpentry of an organ pipe. It would likely have struck her as faintly absurd if she had been told plainly that the entire architecture of contact with the dead she relied upon had descended, however indirectly, from 2 farm girls in upstate New York cracking their toe joints to frighten a nervous household 42 years earlier. And yet it had. Nearly every rap Margaret ever sat through, whatever method actually produced it in Mrs. Vane's parlour, existed within a tradition that traced its lineage directly back to Hydesville. The broader picture worth understanding is how thoroughly the Fox sisters' accidental discovery reshaped the commercial possibilities available to poor and working-class women in particular. Before 1848, there was no clear path by which two teenage girls from a struggling farm family could become internationally recognized figures, sit for the sitting fees of the wealthy, and support an entire extended family through their own labor alone. Spiritualism opened that path almost overnight, and it opened it specifically through a technique so simple that virtually anyone could learn it, which is part of why the movement spread as fast and as widely as it did, among women with no formal education and no capital beyond their own bodies and their own nerve. There is something worth pausing on quietly in the fact that an entire religious and commercial movement, one that would eventually claim millions of adherents and occupy the serious attention of physicists and naturalists, began with two children in the dark, cracking their toes against a bed frame to see what would happen next. If you picture the physical effects produced at a séance, a tambourine sailing across a dark room, a cold hand brushing the back of your neck, a heavy table rising fully off the floor, you probably assume that producing convincing versions of these things in front of alert, suspicious adults would require some seriously advanced secret technology, something almost as mysterious as the spirits it was meant to imitate. The actual reality is that the machinery behind these effects was almost always simple, mechanical, and drawn from the ordinary craft traditions of the period. The same skills a locksmith, a seamstress, or a stage carpenter might have used for entirely unrelated purposes. The single most common tool in a physical medium's repertoire was the telescoping rod, a length of metal fashioned in collapsible sections, often no more than a foot long when closed and capable of extending to 3 or 4 feet, that could be concealed up a sleeve or against a leg and extended silently in the dark to reach a bell on a sideboard, to lift the edge of a table, to touch a sitter's shoulder or hair from a distance that made the touch feel impossible, or to draw a curtain aside just enough to suggest movement. A medium with a free hand and one of these rods, working in a room already darkened for the sitter's comfort, could produce touches and small movements from a considerable distance without ever leaving her chair. The spirit cabinet, a curtained enclosure that had become a standard fixture of physical mediumship by the 1860 seconds, originated most famously with two American brothers, Ira and William Davenport, who were bound with rope inside their cabinet before each performance, ostensibly to prove they could not be responsible for the musical instruments and manifestations that followed. What the Davenports actually relied on was a set of self-releasing knots tied in a way that appeared to an untrained observer to be entirely secure, but that could be loosened and retied by a practiced hand in a matter of seconds once the cabinet curtain was drawn. The English stage magician John Neville Maskelyne, who built much of his own career on reproducing and publicly explaining supposedly supernatural effects, demonstrated the Davenport's rope trick on stage as ordinary conjuring. The technique, once exposed, was studied and reused by an entire generation of mediums who had no interest whatsoever in stage magic as entertainment, only in its usefulness as a tool of belief. Beyond rods and rope work, the more elaborate professional operations relied on features built directly into the architecture of the room itself. Cabinets with false backs allowed a confederate, often a family member or an assistant, dressed in tight-fitting black clothing that rendered them nearly invisible against dark curtains in low light, to slip in and out unseen, or to hand a medium props and materials at the exact moment they were needed. This technique, known on the conjuring stage as the black art, relied on a simple and well-understood property of human vision, that a black shape moving against a black backdrop in dim light becomes essentially unreadable to the eye. and it had already been developed for theatrical illusions on the European stage before mediums adopted it for their own darkened parlours. The same optical principle, doing service first for entertainment and then with barely any modification for grief. Some rooms, particularly those used by mediums wealthy enough to control their own premises rather than renting a parlour by the evening, had trapdoors cut into the floor under a table leg, or sliding panels behind a sideboard. Engineered by a sympathetic or well-paid carpenter with no more moral difficulty than he might have felt building a false-bottom drawer for any other client. The physicist William Crookes, investigating the medium Florence Cook in 1874, described elaborate physical materializations that he judged at the time to be genuine, a conclusion that later investigators and his own contemporaries came to regard with considerable skepticism. In part because Cook's sittings relied on precisely this kind of curtained cabinet architecture that made independent verification nearly impossible by design. A related trade, slate writing, worked its own smaller version of the same architecture. A medium would seal a pair of hinged school slates together, sometimes with a fragment of pencil placed between them, and hold them beneath the table or against a sitter's own knee, producing, after a period of scratching sounds audible but not visible to the sitter, a written message from the dead when the slates were opened. The American medium Henry Slade built an international career on this method until 1876, when he sat for the London zoologist Edwin Ray Lancaster, who seized the slate before the supposed spirit writing had properly finished and found a message already written on it in advance. Incomplete only because Slade had not yet had the chance to finish scratching in the remaining letters at the appropriate dramatic pace, Lancaster had Slade prosecuted for fraud that same year. The conviction was later overturned on a legal technicality rather than any finding that the phenomenon was genuine, and Slade continued practicing, in Europe and America, for years afterward, a pattern of exposure followed by continued practice that repeats itself with remarkably little variation across nearly every documented case in this entire history. Trance mediums who specialized in direct voice work, spirit voices supposedly speaking aloud in the room rather than merely rapping or writing, relied on a simpler prop still, a lightweight cone-shaped trumpet made of tin or aluminum, which the medium held to her own mouth in the dark to disguise and redirect her voice. Passed among confederates seated at points around the room to create the impression that a single spirit voice was moving from place to place. Whispered word through a metal cone takes on a strange, hollow, distant quality that a listener's ear naturally reads as otherworldly, an acoustic trick requiring nothing more sophisticated than the physics of a megaphone in reverse. It became, alongside the rap and the rod, one of the standard tools carried from sitting to sitting by any professional physical medium who wanted her sitters to feel, if only for a moment, that a voice from somewhere else in the room had spoken directly to them. For Margaret Coombs, the physical effects at Mrs. Vane's sittings were never elaborate in this architectural sense. Mrs. Vane rented her rooms by the evening, and had neither the capital nor the fixed premises for trapdoors or false-walled cabinets. What Margaret experienced instead were the smaller, portable effects, a cold touch on the back of her hand that she now understands, though she did not, at the time, could easily have come from a damp cloth wound around the tip of a telescoping rod, a tambourine that rattled and seemed to lift from the sideboard at the exact moment Mrs. Vane's own hands were, according to the sitters on either side of her, still accounted for within the chain. Margaret had felt, more than once, the unmistakable brush of what she took to be a small hand against her own hair, and had gone home that night, more certain than usual that Freddie had been close to her. She had no way of measuring the length of Mrs. Prey. Vane's sleeve, or the particular tension of the fabric at her wrist, or any of the small physical details that a more skeptical observer seated closer, paying different attention, might have noticed. The broader picture is one of a genuine trade with genuine tiers of skill and investment. At the lower end, a struggling medium working out of rented rooms, improvised with whatever cheap materials were available. A length of curtain wire bent into a hook, a borrowed tambourine, a willing niece pressed into service as an occasional confederate. At the higher end, mediums with wealthy patrons and their own fixed premises commissioned custom cabinets from carpenters, ordered specially designed props from theatrical suppliers who also served the conjuring trade, and rehearsed their effects with the same seriousness a stage magician brought to a signature illusion. Harry Houdini, who would spend a significant portion of the 1,920 seconds exposing exactly this kind of machinery, wrote later that the skill involved in producing convincing physical phenomena under difficult conditions was often genuinely impressive as craft, whatever one thought of the purpose it served, and that many of the mediums he investigated were, by his own professional standard as a magician, remarkably good at their work. There is something worth noting quietly here, in the fact that the machinery of the impossible was, in the end, entirely possible, built from rope and metal, and rehearsed hand movements by people who understood their materials with real precision. The dead were not required to lift a single tambourine. A rod, a knot, and a steady hand in the dark did all of the actual work. If you picture a medium correctly naming a sitter's dead husband, describing his illness, and recalling a private nickname only the family used, you probably assume one of two things. Either she possessed some form of real supernatural insight, or she had gone to considerable trouble beforehand, hiring someone to investigate each sitter's private history in detail before the appointment. The actual reality sits closer to neither of those explanations, and is in some ways more unsettling than both, because it required no spying network at all, only attention. The technique now generally known as cold reading was practiced, refined, and passed along informally among mediums for decades before anyone gave it that name. And its core method was disarmingly simple. A medium would open with broad, high probability statements, a name beginning with a certain letter, a reference to someone who passed with trouble in the chest, an illness affecting the head or the throat, phrased with just enough vagueness that most sitters, searching their own memory, could find someone who fit. The sitter, wanting badly for the statement to land, would often supply the specific name or detail herself, in the form of a question or a small exclamation, and the medium, listening carefully, would simply reflect that detail back moments later as though she had known it all along. A sitter leaning forward, a sharp intake of breath, tears beginning at a particular word. All told, a practiced medium exactly which direction to press further, and which to abandon. Beyond this improvisational skill, which some mediums possess to a remarkable degree, investigators in the later decades of the century documented a second, considerably less mysterious source of a medium's apparent knowledge: ordinary information gathering conducted in advance. Some professional mediums, particularly those serving a wealthy or semi-wealthy clientele, kept private notebooks on regular and prospective sitters, recording names of the dead, family relationships, illnesses, private nicknames, and acquaintances willing to talk for a small fee. The American investigator David Abbott, who spent years studying fraudulent mediumship in detail, documented networks of mediums who shared exactly this kind of information with one another, so that a sitter visiting a medium for the first time might already unknowingly be sitting across from someone holding a written record of her late husband's occupation and cause of death. A servant girl paid a few pence for a bit of household gossip about an upcoming client could supply a medium with more specific, more convincing material than an hour of careful cold reading ever could. Not every case resolved neatly into fraud, and the most rigorously studied medium of the era, makes that plain. Leonora Piper, a Boston medium investigated for close to 2 decades by the psychologist William James, and, on behalf of the Society for Psychical Research, by the researcher Richard Hodgson, was watched, tested, and followed by private detectives hired specifically to determine whether she was gathering information about her sitters through ordinary means. Hodgson found no evidence that she was, and James, a rigorous and by no means credulous scientist, concluded that Piper's case alone was sufficient to keep the entire question of genuine mediumship legitimately open, whatever one thought of the rest of the trade. Piper's example matters here precisely because it complicates the tidy picture. Cold reading and information gathering explain the overwhelming majority of what happened in rented parlours across London and Boston alike. They do not appear to explain everything that the era's most careful investigators observed, and honest history has to leave that smaller, stubborn remainder exactly where it sits, unresolved. Investigators who came after Hodgson tried to push the Piper case even further into an experiment known as the cross-correspondences, in which researchers compared fragments of automatic writing produced independently by mediums in different countries, sometimes an ocean apart, looking for evidence that the fragments interlocked into a single, coherent message no single medium could have constructed alone. The project ran for years, absorbed enormous scholarly effort, and produced results that its own investigators described in careful, hedged, deliberately unresolved language, precisely the kind of caution genuine scientific inquiry demands, and precisely the kind of caution that made for considerably less satisfying reading. Most sitters in a rented London parlour never heard of the cross-correspondences at all. The patient, decades-long work of trying to settle the question properly happened almost entirely out of view of the very grief it was meant, eventually, to speak to. The medical profession, watching all of this from the outside, grew seriously alarmed on a different front entirely. The physician Forbes Winslow, a specialist in nervous disorders who ran his own private asylum, published a study in 1877 titled Spiritualistic Madness, arguing from his own case files that repeated attendance at sittings, the nightly strain of trance states, grief, and suggestion working together on an already fragile nervous constitution, had contributed directly to a number of his patients' admissions. Whether Winslow's diagnosis reflected sound medical reasoning or simply the error's habitual suspicion of women's emotional excess is a question later historians have argued over at length. What is not in dispute is that a body of respectable medical opinion existed throughout the period, holding that a grieving woman's regular attendance at séances carried a genuine risk to her own mind, a warning Margaret had heard once, delivered gently from her own family physician, and had chosen, quietly and without argument, to ignore. For Margaret Coombs, the effect of all this was simply that Mrs. Vane knew things. She knew, on Margaret's second visit, that she had lost a young son rather than an older child, though Margaret had said nothing specific about Freddie's age that evening. She knew, months later, that Freddie had been fond of a particular toy soldier, a detail Margaret was fairly certain she had never mentioned aloud, though she had in fact mentioned it during her very first sitting, in a rush of emotion she barely remembered producing, and Mrs. Vane, whether by memory, by written notes, or by simple careful listening, had kept it. Margaret had also, without ever considering it a clue to anything, worn the same small oval locket to every sitting for 4 years. A locket any observant woman running a business built on grief would notice and would understand correctly contained a lock of a dead child's hair. She had cried at the same points in nearly every sitting, given away her son's approximate age by the particular quality of her grief, and mentioned Arthur's occupation, her street, and her general circumstances during ordinary conversation before the sittings even began, the way any two women passing time together naturally do. The broader context worth understanding is that cold reading, as a skill, existed on a genuine spectrum of honesty even within spiritualist practice, in ways that complicate any simple story of pure fraud. Some mediums who relied heavily on reading a sitter's reactions sincerely believed themselves to be receiving genuine spiritual impressions, unaware of how thoroughly their own ordinary observational skill was doing the actual work, since the line between intuition and observation is, even for the person doing the observing, often invisible from the inside. Others understood the mechanism with total clarity and refined it deliberately, the way a skilled interrogator or a skilled salesman refines a technique through repetition, learning exactly which phrases produce the most useful reactions. The written notebooks, where they existed, removed any ambiguity, but they were never universal, and many perfectly successful mediums operated on pure improvisational reading skill alone, needing no notebook at all because they had simply become extraordinarily good at listening to what people, in their grief, could not help revealing about themselves. There is a particular kind of quiet unease worth sitting with in the recognition that what felt to Margaret Coombs like the most supernatural part of her Thursday evenings, the eerily specific knowledge Mrs. Vane seemed to possess of her private life, required no supernatural explanation whatsoever. It required only a woman paying very close attention to another woman's grief, in a room built for exactly that purpose, and giving her, a moment later, exactly what she had already, without meaning to, asked for. If you picture the women running these sittings at all, you probably picture them in one of two ways, and both are a little too simple to hold up. Either she is a pure predator, a calculating fraud with no feeling at all for the grieving women across her table, or she is a passive instrument, a vessel with no agency of her own, carried along by forces or by circumstance. Neither picture leaves much room for an actual person. The actual reality is that Victorian mediumship, whatever else it was, represented one of the very few paths available to a woman in this period toward public voice, independent income, and personal authority, and a great many women walked that path with open eyes and considerable skill. In an era when women were barred from the pulpit, from the vast majority of professions, and from any formal political voice whatsoever, the trance lecture platform offered something close to an exception. Cora L.V. Hatch, an American trance medium, addressed large public audiences on subjects ranging from religion to abolition to the rights of women, delivering, while in her trance state, exactly the kind of extended public argument that a woman speaking plainly in her own voice would rarely have been permitted. The trance itself functioned as a kind of cultural loophole. Words that would have been dismissed, or worse, if spoken by a woman claiming her own authority, were received quite differently when attributed to a spirit control speaking through her, particularly when that control presented as a learned man, a physician, or an ancient sage. The medium disappeared, the audience's understanding, into a channel, and the channel was permitted to say things the woman standing in front of them, unassisted, was not. The economics mattered just as much as the platform. A woman like Mrs. Vane, widowed or abandoned, with no inheritance, no trade, and few respectable options beyond domestic service, needlework, or the increasingly crowded and poorly paid field of governessing, could earn from a single well-attended sitting more than a domestic servant earned in a week. A medium with a reputation, regular clientele, and a rented room she could return to each Thursday had built something rare for a Victorian woman without capital or a husband's income to draw on, an independent livelihood controlled entirely by herself, requiring no employer's permission. Selina Vane, the medium at the center of Margaret Coombs's Thursday evenings, fits this pattern closely, though her own path into the trade was born from a specific and ordinary catastrophe rather than any particular calling. Her husband, a printer's compositor, died of consumption in 1878, leaving her with no children, a small amount of debt, and no trade of her own beyond the plain sewing she had done before her marriage, work that paid barely enough to keep a single woman fed, let alone housed. She discovered, somewhat by accident, in the company of a widowed friend who held informal sittings for comfort rather than profit, that she had a genuine facility for reading a room, for holding an audience's attention, and for producing the small physical effects that practice required. Within 2 years, she had built a modest but real practice, renting her own parlour above the stationer's shop, setting her own hours, answering to no employer, and earning, in a good month, considerably more than she could have earned in service to someone else's household. Whatever Selina Vane believed, privately, about the reality of what passed through her hands on a Thursday evening, and the honest answer is that even she was not entirely certain some weeks, she had built, from almost nothing, a life she controlled. She kept 2 rooms above the stationer's shop for herself, plainly furnished, paid for entirely out of her own sitting fees, and she had not remarried, though she had received at least one offer in the years since her husband's death. She told Margaret once, on an ordinary afternoon with no sitting scheduled, that she had grown used to answering to no one, and that the thought of handing her earnings and her decisions back over to a husband, however kindly meant, had come to feel less like security and more like a door closing on a room she had only just learned to furnish for herself. She kept, in a drawer Margaret never saw, her small photograph of her own husband from their wedding year, and on the anniversary of his death each January, she declined all sittings and told no one why, her private grief of her own tucked quietly beneath the professional management. It helps to remember exactly how narrow her other legal options actually were. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870 and its considerably more thorough successor in 1882, a married woman in England had no independent legal right to her own earnings or property at all, both passing automatically to her husband the moment she married. A widow like Selina Vane, or a woman who had never married, existed in a slightly different legal position, but the practical world she moved through. Banks reluctant to deal with her directly. Professions closed to her by custom, if not always by explicit law. Offered her very little more room to maneuver. Mediumship required no bank's approval, no professional body's license, and no husband's signature. It required only a rented room, a willing clientele, and whatever skill she could bring to the table. Emma Hardinge Britten, the same chronicler who estimated the movement's American following, built an entire independent career touring as a trance lecturer for exactly this reason, addressing audiences on serious subjects in a public capacity that would otherwise have been entirely closed to her as an ordinary woman speaking under her own name. Authority. No single career shows how far that platform could reach, quite like Victoria Woodhull's. Trained from childhood by her own father as a traveling clairvoyant and healer, Woodhull used the credibility, the public speaking practice, and the useful reputation for unconventional boldness that mediumship had given her as a launching point into stockbroking, becoming with her sister one of the first women to run a Wall Street brokerage firm in 1870. And then into politics entirely, declaring her candidacy for President of the United States in 1872, decades before women in most of the country could legally vote for anyone at all, let alone for her. Woodhull's path was extraordinary rather than typical, and no reasonable account of the movement would claim that most mediums ended up running for president, but her career maps, in an unusually vivid and well-documented way, the exact mechanism operating in quieter form in rented parlours across London and Boston alike, a trade that asked no permission from any institution built to keep women out of public life, and that consequently became for a small number of unusually determined women to die a genuine door into rooms the century had otherwise locked against them. The broader context worth holding onto is that the movement's heavy reliance on women was never an accident of temperament, though it was frequently explained that way at the time. Women described as naturally more sensitive, more passive, more suited by their delicate nervous constitution to serve as a vessel for outside forces. This explanation flattered the era's existing prejudices about femininity, even as it quietly handed women professional advantage almost nowhere else available to them. Men served as mediums too, and some of the most famous physical mediums of the century. The Davenport brothers among them were men, but the numerical dominance of women in the trade reflected, in large part, simple economic necessity meeting a rare cultural opening rather than any genuine difference in spiritual aptitude. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, in the discomfort of recognizing that Selina Vane's small, real independence and Margaret Coombs's genuine, unresolved grief were not opposing forces in that rented parlour. They were, in an uncomfortable and very human way, sustaining each other. A woman shut out of nearly every other path to a life of her own had built one in the only marketplace that would fully employ her on the raw material of another woman's loss. Neither fact cancels the other out. Both were simply true, in the same room, at the same time, every Thursday evening. If you picture the glowing, drifting substance that mediums claim to produce from their own bodies, the pale material sitters describe seeing pour from a mouth or an ear and take on shapes in the dark, you probably assume it must have involved some especially clever chemical preparation a substance science of the time could not yet fully explain. Something at least technically mysterious, even if not actually supernatural. The actual reality is considerably more physical and considerably less mysterious than that. The substance itself did not even have a settled name until 1894, when the French physiologist Charles Richer coined the term ectoplasm to describe it for a scientific audience newly curious about physical mediumship. What investigators who managed to get their hands on it, sometimes literally during a sitting, discovered again and again was that it was made of ordinary materials prepared in advance and hidden about the medium's own body. The most common method involved swallowing a length of fine cheesecloth or muslin, folded and rolled tightly enough to be taken down with water before a sitting began, then regurgitated slowly during the trance state, drawn from the mouth a little at a time so that it appeared to emerge from nowhere rather than from a body that had simply put it there hours earlier. Once the effect had been produced and admired, a skilled medium could swallow the same length of cloth back down before the lights returned, leaving nothing for a suspicious sitter to examine afterward. Where cheesecloth was not the material of choice, mixtures of soap flakes and beaten egg white, worked into a thick, stringy paste, produced a similarly pale, faintly luminous substance that could be shaped by hand into crude limb-like forms. Occasionally stiffened with a length of hidden wire to hold its shape for the few seconds sitters were given to look at it before the medium drew it back into darkness. Investigators, who grew suspicious enough to break the usual etiquette of a sitting reaching out in the dark to seize the substance, rather than simply observing it, found exactly what the mechanics above would predict. Samples recovered this way were repeatedly identified, on later examination, as chewed and regurgitated cloth, or as an albumin and soap compound with no biological property remotely resembling living tissue. In some of the most closely investigated cases from the early 20th century, materials pulled from a medium mid-sitting turned out to include cut paper images from magazines, animal tissue purchased from a butcher and shaped to resemble a hand, and lengths of ordinary sewing thread used to manipulate a materialized limb from a distance. None of this required advanced chemistry. It required a strong stomach, steady hand, and the willingness to swallow cloth for a living, which is very nearly the least mysterious sentence it is possible to write about the entire spiritualist movement. It is worth pausing on exactly how credentialed the scientists drawn into this question actually were. Charles Richet, the physiologist who named the substance, went on to win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1913 for entirely unrelated work identifying anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction, which means that one of the most serious scientific minds of his generation sustained professional attention on a substance that turned out to be swallowed cheesecloth. That is not a mark against Richard's actual scientific achievements elsewhere. It is a measure of how seductive the question of physical proof of survival after death remained, even to a mind rigorous enough to eventually earn the highest honor his own field could offer. The French medium known publicly as Eva Carrière, studied extensively in the early years of the following century by the German physician Baron von Schrenck-Notzing, produced ectoplasmic forms photographed at length under laboratory conditions that at first impressed a number of serious researchers. Later examination of those same photographs revealed something considerably less otherworldly. Recognizable faces cut from contemporary newspapers and magazines, glued or pinned to lengths of chewed cheesecloth, and held aloft in exactly the manner our own account of the practice would predict. One of the faces used was later identified as a magazine photograph of a well-known public figure of the day, his printed features doing service for one grieving sitter or another as the face of somebody's own returned dead. The gap between a laboratory's photographic rigor and a magazine clipping pinned to wet muslin captures, about as plainly as anything in this whole history, the distance between how seriously the phenomenon was studied and how simply it was actually made. For Margaret Coombs, the glowing shape she watched pour from Selina Vane's mouth that Thursday evening, the pale ribbon widening into something with the unmistakable curl of a small child's fingers, was very likely nothing more exotic than a carefully folded length of muslin that Mrs. Plaid Vane had swallowed with a glass of water before her sitters arrived, and would swallow again, quietly, once the lamp came back up and the circle broke for tea. Margaret had watched it happen, perhaps a dozen times over 4 years, always in darkness, always for a matter of seconds, always gone by the time anyone might reasonably ask to examine it. She had never once considered what it would have cost Mrs. Vane, physically, to prepare her own body this way, evening after evening, for years, in order to give a grieving woman across the table something that felt, for those few seconds, unbearably like her son reaching for her. What Margaret also never saw, because Mrs. Vane made certain no sitter ever did, was the private half-hour before each sitting, alone in the small back room above the stationer's shop, working the folded muslin down with careful, practiced swallows and a cup of lukewarm water, timing the whole procedure so that the cloth would sit comfortably enough to be forgotten. For the 2 or 3 hours a sitting typically ran, and pliable enough when the moment came to be drawn back up without catching or tearing. It was not a comfortable process on its best evenings, and on the evenings when she had a head cold or had eaten poorly that day, or was simply tired in the particular way that 4 years of doing this to her own body had made increasingly difficult to shake off, it was considerably worse. She never once complained of it to a sitter, because complaining would have meant explaining, and explaining would have ended everything she had built above that stationer's shop in a single sentence. The broader context worth sitting with is that this particular fraud carried a real physical cost that almost none of the sitters who benefited from it ever considered. Repeatedly swallowing cloth, however carefully folded, is not a practice without risk to the body doing the swallowing, and mediums who relied on this method for years at a time reported, in the few candid accounts that survive, chronic throat irritation, digestive trouble, and a persistent low-grade fear of choking that never entirely left them. since a piece of cloth caught wrong, in the dark with an audience watching, was a genuine danger, with no way to summon help without ending the sitting and ending, likely the medium's own livelihood along with it. The scientific community's engagement with the phenomenon, meanwhile, split along familiar lines. Some researchers, sincerely committed to the possibility of a real discovery, continued investigating physical mediumship well into the 20th century, publishing detailed photographic studies of ectoplasm that later scholars have read as documenting, with real scientific rigor, an elaborate and sustained fraud rather than the phenomenon those researchers believed they were studying. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, in the recognition that the single most otherworldly image most sitters carried home from an evening like this, a pale shape taking the form of a hand reaching toward them out of the dark, swallowed down and brought back up in service of a hope she had learned, professionally, exactly how to produce. If you picture the glowing, ghostly faces and hands that sometimes appeared in the darkest corner of a séance room, hovering above a sideboard or floating near the cabinet curtain, you probably assume this was simple theatrical trickery with no more danger attached to it than a modern glow stick or a lick of paint. A cheap effect, faked and forgotten by morning. The actual reality is that the substance most commonly used to produce this glow was phosphorus, dissolved in oil, to create a preparation sometimes called fool's fire. And phosphorus is neither cheap in the sense of being harmless, nor forgettable in the sense of leaving no mark. White phosphorus is seriously toxic to human skin on contact, capable of producing chemical burns with repeated exposure, and it is in sufficient concentration, prone to igniting on contact with open air once it dries past a certain point, which made any preparation involving it a small, deliberate risk taken fresh before every sitting that used it. The same substance was, at the very same moment, in Victorian Britain, poisoning workers by the thousand in a far more visible and far more public way. Phosphorus was the essential ingredient in the Strike Anywhere matches manufactured at factories like Bryant and May in London's East End, and the young women who dipped matchsticks in it for a living for years at a time developed a documented occupational disease known as phosphorus necrosis or phossy jaw, PAW, in which the chemicals slowly rotted the bone of the jaw from repeated vapor exposure in poorly ventilated workrooms. The match girls at Bryant and May struck against exactly these conditions in the summer of 1888, an event that drew national attention to just how dangerous a substance ordinary Victorian households kept, unremarked, in a box on the mantel. The substance had been a fixture of ordinary domestic life for decades by the time the match girls struck. The earliest friction matches, sold from the 1830 seconds onward, under names like Lucifer's, used white phosphorus heads that ignited so easily and so unpredictably that house fires and accidental poisonings from matches left within a child's reach were a recognized hazard of their own. A considerably safer alternative, using red phosphorus instead of white and igniting only against a specially prepared striking surface, had existed since a Swedish inventor named Gustav Erik Pasch patented the method in 1844, but adoption across British industry remained slow and uneven for decades afterward. Driven by cost, rather than any lack of awareness that a safer option already existed, a medium buying phosphorus for a luminous effect in the 1880 seconds was, in other words, purchasing a substance whose dangers were neither new nor obscure to anyone who cared to ask, only cheap, available, and, for her particular purpose, a medium reaching for a phosphorescent preparation to paint a glowing hand or a faint luminous outline onto a strip of muslin, was, in this sense, borrowing directly from the same dangerous chemistry that was simultaneously destroying the health of factory girls a few miles away. Painted onto a cloth or onto the medium's own skin shortly before a sitting, the oil produced a faint, eerie glow, visible only once the gas had been turned down or extinguished entirely, which is one further reason. But the preparation had to be handled with real care. Applied too heavily, or allowed to dry unevenly, it risked scorching skin or, in the worst documented cases from the period's stage magic and exhibition trade, catching briefly alight if it came anywhere near an open candle or a still warm gas fitting, a genuine fire hazard in a room full of heavy curtains, dry crepe mourning fabric, and 8 seated adults in the dark. Newspapers of the period occasionally carried brief reports of exactly this kind of accident at exhibition halls and traveling spirit photography booths that relied on the same luminous chemistry for their effects. Curtains scorched a performer's sleeve, briefly alight, put out quickly enough, but real all the same, and a plain reminder that the glow sitters found so moving was never quite as harmless as candlelight. Margaret Coombs had, on more than one occasion, watched a faint, pale glow rise near the sideboard at Mrs. Paul Vane's sittings, a shape she had always understood as a spirit face gathering just enough substance to be glimpsed before fading again into the dark. She had noticed, without ever thinking much of it, a faint reddened patch on the inside of Mrs. Vane's wrist that never entirely healed, and had accepted when she asked once, out of simple kindness, Vane's explanation that it was a touch of eczema, aggravated by the coal fire. She had never once connected this small, persistent mark to the glowing shapes she had come to look forward to seeing in the dark, and she had certainly never considered that the room she sat in every Thursday evening, already close with the mingled smell of coal smoke and 8 bodies breathing in a small space, an open chemical flame risk sitting a few feet from her own chair. Her own kitchen, at home in Peckham, kept a box of ordinary strike-anywhere matches on the mantel shelf, exactly the same class of household object, and it would never once have crossed her mind to connect that everyday box. Vane's parlour, since one was simply how a fire got lit for the evening kettle, and the other was, as far as she understood it, an entirely different kind of light altogether. The broader context is that phosphorus's easy availability, cheap, unregulated, sold openly for use in matches and household preparations well into the final years of the century, made it a natural choice for anyone seeking a luminous effect on a tight budget, long before any wider public understanding of its toxicity. It would take the continued activism of match factory workers and the slow adoption of the considerably safer red phosphorus in place of the white variety across the following decades before either match manufacturing or informal domestic use of the substance became meaningfully less dangerous. In the meantime, mediums who wanted their spirits to glow paid for the effect in the same currency the match girls paid, in a slow, cumulative cost to their own bodies that their sitters, moved and grateful in the dark, never had any reason to notice. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, in the fact that the same chemical destroying the jaws of teenage girls in a bow factory that same summer was, a few miles away, in a rented parlour, being carefully painted onto a woman's own skin to make a grieving mother believe, for a few seconds, that she was looking at her dead son's face. The danger was real in both rooms. Only one of them ever made the newspapers. If you picture the eventual exposure of a fraudulent medium, you probably picture something clean and final, a skeptic walking into the room, catching the trick red-handed, the whole business collapsing on the spot, the believers in the room instantly and gratefully relieved of their delusion. Evidence presented, case closed, everyone goes home wiser. The actual reality took decades, involved serious scientific institutions, and rarely resolved as neatly as that picture suggests. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882 by figures including the philosopher Henry Sidgwick and the classicist Frederick Myers spent years developing rigorous test conditions and investigating mediums across the country with a level of scientific care that, whatever its subject, was seriously rigorous in method. Some of its most dramatic findings came not from careful, controlled testing, but from moments of simple physical confrontation. In January of 1880, the writer and antiquarian Sir George Sitwell, sitting at a materialization performed by the medium Florence Cook, whose spirit control, called Katie King, had by then convinced serious scientific figures, including William Crookes, of her authenticity, reached out in the dark and seized the glowing white-draped figure by the wrist. He called immediately for a light. What the light revealed, before the figure could retreat into the curtain cabinet, was Florence Cook herself, undressed to her underclothes, holding a length of white drapery that had, moments before, been performing as a spirit from beyond the grave. Harry Houdini's own campaign against fraudulent mediumship, conducted with real seriousness across the 1,920 seconds, took the same basic method and applied it with a magician's practiced eye rather than a startled sitter's grasping hand. Houdini served on a committee assembled by Scientific American magazine, which had offered a cash prize to any medium who could produce genuine physical phenomena under conditions a panel of scientists and one professional magician could not explain by ordinary means. The most famous subject of that investigation, a Boston medium known publicly only as Marjorie, whose real name was Mina Crandon, produced effects that impressed several of the panel's scientific members, and that Houdini, watching with the trained eye of a man who had spent his own career designing exactly this kind of illusion, identified immediately as mechanical trickery, built a duplicate cabinet to demonstrate, and exposed in exhaustive published detail. He would go on in 1926 to testify before the United States Congress in support of legislation against fortune-telling fraud, arguing from decades of direct professional experience that the techniques involved were, in his own careful phrase, the Italian medium Eusapia Palladino, whose earlier Cambridge investigation we touched on already, crossed the Atlantic in 1910 and sat for a committee at Harvard led by the psychologist Hugo Munsterberg, who caught her under conditions considerably looser than she was accustomed to, freeing a foot to produce a table movement herself. Munsterberg published his findings plainly, and Palladino's American reputation never fully recovered, though she continued to find sitters in Europe for several more years afterward. Arthur Conan Doyle's own break with Houdini, meanwhile, hardened over a specific and rather painful episode in 1922, when Doyle's wife, herself a practicing medium, produced through automatic writing a message Doyle was convinced came from Houdini's own dead mother. Wouldnt, in English, his mother had never spoken fluently in life, and signed with a cross his Jewish mother would never have used. Houdini said so, plainly and immediately. Doyle did not withdraw his belief in the message's authenticity for the rest of his life. A small, specific disagreement between two famous men that captures, in miniature, the same unresolvable gap between evidence and need running through every other case in this chapter. And yet, again and again, across every one of these documented exposures, a significant number of believers did not abandon their faith in the wider phenomenon, even when the specific fraud in front of them had been laid bare in humiliating physical detail. Florence Cook continued to find sitters, defenders, for years after the Sitwell incident. Mina Crandon retained loyal supporters, including at least one member of the original Scientific American panel, well after Houdini's exposure was published. This is not, on reflection, difficult to understand. Believers were rarely evaluating evidence in the way a courtroom evaluates evidence. They were managing grief, and the medium in front of them, whatever her methods, had become bound up with their only remaining sense of contact with a person they could not otherwise reach. Losing faith in the medium meant, for many sitters, losing the connection to the dead child or husband a second time in a manner that felt every bit as final and every bit as devastating as the original loss itself. Some sitters described it in the few candid accounts that survive as worse than the funeral. The funeral, at least, had not required them to admit they had been fooled. Margaret Coombs had witnessed something of this dynamic firsthand, though at one remove, years before she ever sat with Mrs. Vane, the widow from Maida Vale, who sat beside her most Thursday evenings, the woman who wept quietly before every sitting, had confided once in a rare, unguarded moment over tea that she had attended another medium entirely in her first year of widowhood. A woman, later exposed by a skeptical relative who had insisted on lighting a match at an inopportune moment and revealed plainly a Confederate crouched behind a folding screen. The widow had not stopped believing. She had simply stopped attending that particular medium, found her way eventually to Mrs. Vane's parlour instead, and never spoken of the earlier episode again until that single afternoon with Margaret, her voice carefully flat, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else. Margaret understood, listening to her, a version of doubt she had never quite allowed herself to feel directly about Mrs. Vane, a doubt that lived for both women permanently at the edge of the room, rather than in the center of it, acknowledged just enough to be managed and never quite enough to be resolved. The Society for Psychical Research's most ambitious project of the entire period was not aimed at any single medium at all. Published in 1894, the Census of Hallucinations surveyed more than 17,000 people across Britain and abroad about whether they had ever, in a waking state, experienced a vivid apparition or vision of a person later found to have died, and reported a small but statistically notable pattern in the results that the investigators themselves treated with considerable caution rather than triumphant certainty. It remains one of the largest formal studies of its kind ever conducted, a reminder that the serious, methodical, faintly obsessive effort to settle this question scientifically was never confined to catching a single medium's rope trick, and that some of the era's most careful minds spent genuine years of their working lives trying to measure something that has still more than a century later never been measured to everyone's satisfaction. The broader picture, viewed across the whole final quarter of the century, is one of a slow, uneven erosion of spiritualism's mainstream scientific and social credibility, rather than any single decisive collapse. Each fresh exposure of Cook, of Palladino, of the American mediums investigated by Houdini's committee in the following decades, chipped away a little more at the movement's claim to serious scientific standing, even as it continued, largely undisturbed in its own popular and religious life, to hold Sunday meetings, ordain its own ministers, and comfort its own grieving sitters well into the 20th century. Arthur Conan Doyle famously never wavered, remaining a committed spiritualist until his death in 1930, and conducting a long public dispute with his own former friend Houdini over exactly this question: evidence on one side, need on the other, neither man ever quite managing to convince the other. Spiritualism did not die with the century. It simply moved gradually from the center of respectable scientific curiosity to the margins of religious practice, carrying with it into those margins both its genuine frauds and its genuinely comforted believers. The movement's own institutions consolidated even as its wider scientific standing declined. In 1890, the very year Margaret Coombs is sitting with Mrs. Vane, British spiritualist societies were in the process of organizing themselves into what would become, within the year, the Spiritualists' National Union, a formal federation intended to give the movement's many independent congregations. Very much the behavior of a religion settling into permanence, rather than a fad preparing to vanish. Even Houdini, the movement's most famous and most dogged public opponent, left behind him a small private wish that the whole practice might, against his own professional judgment, turn out to be true. Before his death in 1926, he and his wife Bess agreed on a secret coded message known only to the two of them that he would try to send back to her if any form of genuine communication with the dead proved possible after all. Bess held a séance every year on the anniversary of his death for a decade afterward, sitting in the dark with mediums and with no one at all, waiting for a code that never came. She finally extinguished the candle she had kept burning for him in 1936, telling reporters that 10 years was long enough and that she no longer believed he was trying to reach her. It is a strange tender coda to a life spent exposing exactly this kind of hope, and it says something true about the whole subject that even the century's sharpest professional skeptic could not fully separate what he knew to be false from what he privately wished might be real. There is something worth sitting with quietly here, in the recognition that the lights coming on rarely worked the way the skeptics of the era hoped it would. A grabbed wrist, a struck match, a magician's patient published exposure, all of it proved beyond reasonable dispute exactly how the trick was done. None of it could touch the actual engine driving the belief, which was never really curiosity about mechanism at all. It was a mother, or a widow, or a father, sitting in the dark, needing very badly for someone to still be there. Step back from any single chapter of this, and a handful of patterns start to emerge, the kind that only become visible once you have spent enough time inside the details to stop being surprised by any one of them individually. The first is simply this. The performance was extraordinary, the machinery behind it considerably less so. Wrap produced by a cracked toe joint, a hand made of chewed cheesecloth, a glowing face painted on with a chemical bought at the same shop that sold matchsticks. None of it was sophisticated in the way the effect it produced was sophisticated. What made the whole apparatus work was never the cleverness of any single trick. It was the incredible amount of ordinary, patient, repeated labor that went into deploying a fairly simple trick with total confidence, night after night, for years, in front of people whose entire emotional world depended on not noticing. Selina Vane did not need to invent anything new when she sat down across from Margaret Coombs each Thursday. She needed only to execute, competently and calmly, a set of techniques that had already been refined by hundreds of women before her, across 4 decades, in rented rooms exactly like her own. The second pattern sits underneath the first, and it is the more important one. Nothing in this entire history, not the rods, not the knots, not the phosphorus, not the cheesecloth, actually explains why spiritualism grew as large as it did. Those mechanics explain how a fraud was executed once a sitter had already walked through the door. They do not explain why so many sitters kept walking through it decade after decade, in the face of exposure after exposure, in defiance of professors and magicians and grabbed wrists and struck matches. The real engine driving this movement, from Hydesville in 1848 to the rented parlour above a Marylebone stationer's shop in 1890, was never curiosity about the mechanism of contact with the dead. It was grief arriving in a culture that had built an elaborate etiquette for displaying mourning and almost no honest structure for processing it. A society that buried children by the thousand and told its widows only how long to wear a veil had left an enormous need standing in the middle of the room with nowhere to go. Spiritualism did not manufacture that need. It simply arrived at the one moment in a century when a whole industry could be built around meeting it. The third pattern is the uncomfortable one, and it involves the women who ran that industry rather than the women who sat in its chairs. For every Margaret Coombs paying for comfort, there was, more often than not, a Selina Vane on the other side of the table. A woman who had found, in this specific and morally complicated trade, one of the very few doors in her entire century that opened for her without a husband's signature. It would be simpler and considerably less honest to describe every medium as either a monster preying on grief or a helpless woman with no other choice. Most of them were neither or both, depending on the week, the sitter, and the state of their own finances. The same room that exploited Margaret's loss also sustained Selina's independence, and history rarely offers the tidy villain a documentary would prefer. It offers, instead, two women, each managing the only resources actually available to her, meeting in the middle of a transaction that comforted one and supported the other, and cost something real to both. The fourth pattern concerns the astonishing durability of belief once it has attached itself to grief rather than to evidence. Every single exposure covered in this account, the toe joints, the seized wrist, the published confession, the magician's careful reconstruction, was, on its own terms, conclusive. None of them, on their own, ended anything. Believers absorbed each exposure the way a river absorbs a stone, closing back over it and continuing in very nearly the same direction as before. Because the actual question they were asking at that table was never, is this technically real? It was, am I going to be alone with this loss for the rest of my life? And no seized wrist has ever been much of an answer to that question. This is not evidence of Victorian foolishness. It is evidence of a specifically human arithmetic that has not changed nearly as much as the intervening century likes to pretend, in which a genuine need will consistently outweigh a technically sound piece of evidence, given the right amount of grief sitting behind it. The fifth pattern is a quieter one, and it concerns the century doing all this concealing rather than any single medium inside it. The 1890s inherited from the decades before them an almost unshakable faith in mechanism, in the steam engine, the telegraph, the sewing machine, in the idea that enough careful engineering could solve almost any problem a body or a distance could put in front of it. The spiritualist trade, whatever else it was an entirely characteristic product of that same faith, turned toward an entirely different problem. Telescoping rod, a self-releasing knot, a cabinet with a false back, a chemical formulated to glow in the dark. These were not the tools of some separate, superstitious culture, standing apart from Victorian ingenuity. They were that ingenuity applied with real skill to the single problem industrial progress could never actually touch, the fact of death itself. The same century that built railways across a continent and laid cable across an ocean floor also built quietly, and in considerably smaller workshops, an entire toolkit for making its own dead appear to speak. And it should not surprise anyone that a culture this confident in its own mechanical cleverness would eventually turn that cleverness toward its single, most stubborn, and least solvable grief. For Margaret Coombs, on any given Thursday evening in the autumn of 1890, all 5 of these patterns are present in the room at once, though she has never once named a single one of them to herself in these terms. She sits down at a rented table because a specific culture failed to give her anywhere else to put a specific and enormous loss. She watches a competent, patient tradeswoman execute a set of well-rehearsed physical techniques with total confidence. She benefits in her own grief from the same rented independence that keeps Selina Vane housed and fed, And whatever doubt occasionally brushes against the edge of her evening, it never once outweighs the simple, overwhelming fact that for a few minutes in the dark, she gets to feel that Freddie is still somewhere, still growing, still hers in some fashion the daylight world has never once managed to offer her. There is something worth sitting with, quietly, in all of this. Something closer to recognition than to judgment. The Victorians did not invent the impulse to reach for the dead when the living world has given you nowhere else to put your love for them. They only built with unusual craft and unusual scale a specific room in which that impulse could be met, imperfectly, dangerously, and at real cost to the women doing the meeting. The room is gone now. The impulse underneath it has never gone anywhere at all. Return now to the room where we began. The gas turned down to its faint blue murmur. The mahogany table, the burgundy chenille worn thin at the corners under 8 pairs of linked hands. A woman in mourning silk, gone slightly dull at the elbows, her hair pinned back in a plain practical knot, sitting very still while something pale gathers itself in the dark across the table and takes on for a few unbearable seconds. You know now what that hand very likely was. A length of muslin, swallowed down with a glass of water half an hour before the sitters arrived, brought back up slowly in the dark by a woman who had learned, out of ordinary economic necessity, rather than any special gift, exactly how to make it look like something reaching across the distance between the living and the dead. You know that the bell and the rap it followed traced their lineage back to 2 farm girls in upstate New York, cracking their toe joints against a bed frame 42 years earlier, in a joke that outgrew every intention either of them ever had for it. You know that the darkness in the room was never really about the comfort of the spirits at all, and that the chain of joined hands, however sincerely felt, was built to be broken by exactly one practiced pair of fingers. You know about the rods hidden in a sleeve, the trick knots in a curtained cabinet, the notebook of names and nicknames, some mediums kept and others never needed, because a grieving woman's own face, her own tears, her own locket worn at the throat, told a patient listener nearly everything she had come there to ask about. You know that the substance called ectoplasm was cheesecloth, soap, and egg white, that the glow in a medium's hand was a chemical dangerous enough to blister her own skin and burn the very curtains around her, and that when the lights finally did come on, grabbed wrists and struck matches and published confessions in hand. It changed astonishingly little about what the woman across the table actually needed from the encounter. None of this makes the woman sitting at that table a fool. Margaret Coombs is 34 years old. She has spent 4 years and something over 200 evenings, paying out of a household budget. She and Arthur can only barely spare for a few minutes of feeling that her son still exists somewhere, still growing, still safe, still hers. She has done the arithmetic of his lost birthdays in the dark more times than she could count. She has worn the same locket against her throat, under her collar, for 6 years, touching it without meaning to, dozens of times a day. She has sat in a room built, board by board and knot by knot, around the specific shape of her grief, by a woman managing her own considerable griefs in the only trade that would fully employ her. And she has kept going back, Thursday after Thursday, not because she has been fooled in any simple sense, but because the alternative, the empty house, the silence after the children are asleep, the 3 in the morning arithmetic with absolutely no one to answer it, has always been so very much worse. She is resilient, resourceful, and quietly exhausted, in the specific way of a woman who has been carrying an enormous weight for 6 years with almost no one to share the actual carrying of it. She is not the porcelain figure of grief the era's own mourning etiquette liked to picture, the veiled widow fading decorously into black crepe and silence. She's a person in a complicated body, in a demanding world, managing an impossible loss with whatever tools her century actually made available to her. A locket, a Thursday evening, a rented room above a stationer's shop, and a woman across the table who is, on any given night, either a comfort or a fraud or, more often than either word alone can quite hold, both at once. And she looks magnificent, sitting there in the dark, with her hand joined to a stranger's on either side. Not despite any of what you now know about that room. Right in the middle of all of it, the toe joints and the telescoping rods and the cheesecloth and the phosphorus and the careful, practiced listening, she is still, unmistakably, a mother, reaching in the only direction left open to her toward a 5-year-old boy who is never coming back through that door and who she has never, not for one single Thursday in 6 years, been willing to simply let go of. The lamp will come back up in a few minutes. As it always does, the tea will be poured. The 8 strangers at that table will put their coats back on, murmur their thanks and their good nights, and walk back out into a London going on exactly as it was. Going on the way cities always do, indifferent to any particular grief inside any particular room. Margaret Coombs will go home to Peckham, to Arthur, to the 2 children still sleeping soundly upstairs, to a house that asks nothing further of her tonight, beyond the ordinary competence she has always given it. She will not know, tonight, or perhaps ever, precisely what was true, and what was cloth, and what was somewhere uncertain in between. She will only know that for a few minutes in a dark room above a stationer's shop, she felt her son close to her again, and that tomorrow, and the Thursday after that, she will very likely come back for exactly that feeling one more time. The candle in this room has burned low. The mahogany table is still there. The chairs still faintly warm. But you see the woman sitting at it differently now, and you see the room around her differently too. Every board and curtain and careful shadow of it. That is worth something. Good night.